Hello, I'm Anthony. Welcome to the Steinberg Halion 7 tutorial series. Today we're going to have a look at a MIDI module that comes bundled with Halion and is actually a part of the default preset. It's called the FlexPhraser and it allows us to build arpeggios and sequences inside Halion. Just before we start today, can I point you at the Patreon and YouTube channel member links below? It's the best way to support my channel and help me carry on making this content. And without further ado, let's get on with it. Click on the FlexPhraser. And if you're looking at either the sound section or the MIDI modules section, then you're going to see the FlexPhraser. By default, there's not much to see because it's not activated. We're going to click the black on black active button, which if you've got backlights behind your monitors is a nightmare to see. It's about there. Brilliant, well done me. And there's the FlexPhraser. So now that it's active, all MIDI that flows through this module is going to be basically transformed. I'm going to press a single note on the keyboard. That single note that I'm playing is being turned into an arpeggio. If I play a 3-note C major chord, it's playing those notes up and down repetitively. Now the reason it's going up and down at the moment is that by default, when you load a FlexPhraser, alternate one or alternate one, depending on whether or not you want it to be a verb or a noun, is the default phrase that's selected. I'm going to choose to make this word a noun, so I'm going to use the word alternate. If I click on the word itself, you get a very large selection of pre-built banks to play with. Now the classic ARP contains alternate one, so if I open that folder and I switch to up instead, play the C major, and now it's playing those notes arpeggiated but always in an up manner. But the FlexPhraser isn't just an arpeggiator, it's also a sequencer. So let's open the sequence folder, and in the general subfolder let's choose acid line. So now I'm going to play one single note on the keyboard, but instead of it playing an arpeggio, it's going to play a sequence. So you can hear there's rhythm content and there's also tonal content. Now I'm going to play that C major chord again, but instead of it playing an arpeggio, it's going to play a very complex sequence of notes. Listen to this. So you can see I've got 3 notes held down on the keyboard. Very difficult to make out what's going on there. A really nice trick if you're playing with FlexPhrasers and you want to figure out what the pattern or the phrase is doing in the background is to record it into an internal buffer, drag it into Cubase, and then we can analyze the notes. So let's do that with this simple C major chord. I'm going to engage record mode, which is this little button here. And now can you see this MIDI lights flashing? Halion's waiting for me to play some notes. So here goes the C major chord. Now I can let this play for as long as I like. Some phrases are longer than others, but that's clearly repeating itself at that point. Disengage record, and now the little blue button associated with this drag MIDI phrase command has been lit up. That means there's information inside the FlexPhraser buffer that I can drag into Cubase. Just pick it up, drag it over here. And can you see when I pressed the record button and then I chatted to you for a few seconds, all of that pre-nonsense has been abandoned. Basically, FlexPhraser has a gate waiting for action and it doesn't actually open the gate until I press the first note on the keyboard. So let's close Halion for a moment and have a look at what we've got. Now I must have pressed into the notes slightly when I was playing that chord because you can see we've got aftertouch information as well. Don't particularly want that, so I'll just select all of the aftertouch, get rid of it to clean stuff up. So here's the notes of that sequence that's basically stored in that phrase. In other words, this is the sort of the DNA of the sound. And you can see that with the C's and E's and G's that I've played on the keyboard are being distributed across this sequence to make a complex phrase. I'm going to drag this out of the way. This time we're going to go back and sort of reverse engineer it. I'm going to engage record mode, but this time I'm only going to play a C. Let's find out what the actual phrase itself is without any additional complexity. Here we go. Drag that up into Cubase and close it down. What I'm doing now is duplicating the track, drag the two parts together so that they're aligned, lock everything in place, and now I can jump backwards and forwards between these two sequences and show you what happens when I play that chord. It's basically parceling the notes out according to the rules inside the FlexPhraser. Now, occasionally I will do sort of forensic analysis on how sequences interact with multiple played notes. It's an exceptionally complex subject. We'd be here for half an hour just deconstructing this single preset, and I don't think that's the best use of anyone's time. But suffice to say that the options set in this page effectively define how that sequence is going to be played. Let's make one small change to demonstrate the point. At the moment, we have an option called Key Mode Sort Engaged. It means when I press that chord, regardless of how the chord was played, it's always sorting from lowest to highest, so we're going to get a C, an E, and a G. If I switch to As Played and play those notes slightly high early, so I'll play the G, then the E, then the C, now we've got a new sequence. It's effectively reordering those notes and applying the sequence template over the top. My TLDR at this point is try not to overthink the FlexPhraser. Use it as an inspirational tool. I'll show you a couple of examples today where we don't try to figure out exactly the order of the notes that are going to get played back, because it's exceptionally complex. Particularly when you're dealing with something as complex as a sequence, it's just very, very difficult to figure out exactly how the notes are being interpreted. So I tend to use this as a bit of a sandpit. I'll play with the controls until I hear something that sounds really nice, and then I'll use that as kind of, an inspirational jumping point. I'm going to reinitialize this program, simplify everything back down to its initial values, jump back over to the FlexPhraser, turn it on. Now, having had a very quick look at an example of an arpeggio and a sequencer, let's have a bit more of a closer look at some of the options inside this screen. I'll leave the default phrase, which is alternate 1, in place, so it's going to go up and down. If I play a C major chord, it's going to play C, E, G, E, C, E, G, E, C. And if I engage hold and press a single chord, it's going to do that in the background. Now I'll change tempo scale from 1/16 to 1/8, which will basically make it run half as fast. So all of this is currently synced to Cubase. So we've got this curious 106 BPM, which must be from something else I've done recently, I don't know what. If I disengage sync, then we have a manually editable tempo, currently set to 120 BPM, but the tempo scale still works. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. If I switch it to 1/16, it's going to run twice as fast. Gate scale allows us to control the length of each of the notes. It's basically how long it's going to be on versus off. At 100, if I control click, that's the default length of the note. So basically it's going to play continuously. If I make the gate length go past 100, it's effectively playing mini chords in between each of those transitions now. One note is overspanning into the next. Then we can increase the number of octaves that are played. At octave range 0, it just plays the default notes. But if I make octave range 1, it's now spanning over 2 octaves. Getting pretty self-evident. We can map the velocities of the notes that are played to an external controller. So if we engage velocity controller, we get a sub-menu giving us a standard suite of options. So let's choose the modulation wheel. I'm going to engage hold. I'm going to turn my modulation wheel, see it moving in the bottom left-hand corner, turn the modulation wheel all the way down and press my C major chord. And you won't hear anything because the modulation wheel is now controlling the velocity of the played notes. Bring in my mod wheel. There it is, fully mapped. Then we have swing. Swing's a little bit difficult to demonstrate if we're alternating up and down. So let's put us in up mode and play 2 notes. I'll just play a C and an E. Slow it down a bit. So we have a long note and then a short note. You can also have negative swing, basically just inverts the order, makes the short note come first. Quite difficult to tell, but that's a short note followed by a long note. And all of that can be stored as a variation. We have 8 basically presets to play with. All of the controls and most of the controls in the FlexPhraser can be assigned to a variation. It's implicit. Everything that we've done so far as inherently being assigned to variation number 1. If, for instance, I jump over to variation number 2, the phrase will jump back to alternate 1 because that's the default. That's what everything is currently set to. But number 1 has all of the values that we assign to it. It's also quite nice to assign these variations to trigger pads. We've not really spoken about trigger pads up until this point, but they're actually kind of lurking at the bottom left-hand corner of the interface. Trigger pad number 1, if I right click, I can say take a snapshot of the current variation. So this is dedicated to the FlexPhraser, this option. If I select snapshot variation, then this trigger pad has now been assigned all of the values for this variation. If I jump over to variation number 2 and assign that to trigger pad 2, now each time I click one of these pads, you see I'm activating the different variations of the FlexPhraser, and these pads can then go on to be assigned to hardware controllers. So it's a nice way to kind of gain access to your FlexPhraser variations at the interface level. These trigger pads will be available in the interface regardless of what you're looking at in the program tree. I've reinitialized the program. I'm going to load a new phrase now that's significantly more complex than the acid line we looked at a little while ago. Now initially this is going to seem a little bit random and the results aren't going to be particularly impressive. In the construction sets folder, we drill into guitar, steel, and I'm going to select a compo 1. Now I'm going to play my C major chord. Not particularly impressive. What I'm going to do now, however, is jump over to my media bay and load a preset in the Halion Sonic Factory library called One Finger Fast Strumming 6 String. Let's load this and jump back over to the program tree. Now when we have a look at the FlexPhraser, okay, fair enough. You can see that the same phrase has been loaded in. Now I'm going to play my C major chord. This phrase has been built specifically with a guitar in mind. I'm going to record this and drag it into Cubase so we can have a look at what's going on. Just basically record for as long as you think it's taken for that to repeat. That's pretty obvious that that's repeated at this point. Drag it across. And let's see what we've got. Here are the chords of the phrase, but there's a lot more going on as well. If we scroll right down to the bottom, there's a little note at C#-2, and then right up at the top, there's a load of notes in the 6s and 7s as well. Let's have a look inside this preset. If we open the 6-string preset, now I'm not going to get too far down this particular rabbit hole, but I'm going to open one folder as by way of demonstration of what's going on here. We have a key switch set to C#-2. This is specifying the particular type of guitar that's going to be played. We're going to be playing open position number 2. So there are key switches embedded inside the phrase. And as you can see, this preset has key switches that are specifically designed to be used with this phrase. Now, this is a bit of a can of worms because obviously you don't know when you're browsing phrases what kind of sounds are supposed to map to these phrases. It is a little bit hit and miss, but don't take for granted that every phrase that you drag across is going to make complete sense. In fact, there's actually an option in the interface, key switches off, here it is. It says filter out key switches and noises. Essentially, if you want to disregard any information that might kind of inadvertently cause unwanted side effects for your preset, if you don't want C#-2s being sent into the instrument that could have any sort of consequence, if it's not a guitar program, you can basically just filter that stuff out. But these phrases have got a lot of information in them, and only when you drag them into Cubase are you actually going to find out what they do. Let's reinitialize once more. And this time we'll have a look at the user folder. So everything that we've seen so far has come for free. This is the bundled stuff with Halion, but we can build our own phrases as well. By default, we have a one-step and very uninspiring, effectively repeating note. Drag this little arrow across. Let's make an 8-step sequence, and these blue bars represent the velocities. So you can see each one of those notes being played. We can set a velocity curve by clicking in one of the bars and then kind of dragging with the mouse. Then there's a whole raft of keyboard commands involving controls, alts and shifts. If I press the shift key and drag up and down with my mouse, I scale all the velocities vertically. If I click alt and drag, I have a line. Shift-Alt is pretty funny. I'm going to click in the window and start dragging, and I basically have a symmetrical around the central axis where I'm affecting kind of the beginning and end of the phrase simultaneously. Just hold the Control key down and click in any individual bar to set its velocity to 127. If I hold Control and Shift and click in any bar, it sets all velocities to 127. Then we can edit individual gate lengths for each of the steps. Remember, we have an overall gate scale by which we can determine how long all of the notes are, but we can also edit them individually. So let's make some of these notes very short. As I move around the bar, can you see as I approach the right edge, it's quite difficult to see, but the right hand side of the bar turns dark blue. If I click and start dragging now, then I'm controlling the gate length. If I drag this across into step number 2, it's going to merge them together. Oops, accidentally clicked a right click there. Here we go. So let's merge all of those 3 steps together, and you can see that steps 2 and 3 have now been disabled. They've effectively discarded because this is one very long note. Pick up that little blue bar again and start dragging it to the left. Now, if I make that note very small, I need to manually re-enable steps number 2 and 3. So let's have a couple of other short notes as well. There we go. If I want to reset this step to fill in this gap again, to basically make it continuous, I can right click, fill gap, and it'll make it 100% again. Drag it smaller. Or I can press Control Shift and then hover over that little border to set all of the steps to 100%. Let's switch over to transpose values, and these zeros represent offsets for notes that are going to be played. So if I introduce some offsets, 7 semitones is going to be a perfect 5th, and then we'll have a perfect 4th and a minor 3rd, and get that going. And this is where the FlexPhraser really lends itself to being creative, because basically making any small adjustment starts giving you really interesting results. If, for instance, I make this a 9-bar sequence, got a really interesting kind of syncopated pattern. We can emphasize that syncopation by disabling some of the steps. Let's turn off step number 3. We're a single click away from duplicating this entire phrase. There's an option down in the left-hand side of these controls called Duplicate Phrase. Let's just click that. And now it's doubled the number of steps. We have an 18-step sequence. In addition to being able to create velocity patterns, we can also create controller patterns. We have 3 user-definable controller banks. What I've done off camera is to set up myself a simple sawtooth, turned off 2 of the oscillators. I've got a sawtooth with a very simple classic filter, cut off set to 12 o'clock, 50%. And I'm going to use an unassigned MIDI continuous controller value, create myself a new modulation connection to filter cutoff. And I'm going to add a modulation value for a controller value that I don't currently have any mappings for, so it's essentially unused. Let's say controller 102. Turn the depth up and back over to the sound. Now I can assign one of these controller lanes to that value. Scroll down to, here's controller 102. And now if I draw some MIDI information, that's basically going to be completely inoffensive if you don't subscribe to this controller lane. But if you assign the modulation to your filter cutoff, you're basically going to get this filter sweep as part of the played back phrase. Let's hear that. Basically, the FlexPhraser is a MIDI transformer. So when the FlexPhraser receives a command, it's going to say, well, what am I going to do now? Well, in response to a single played MIDI note, I'm now going to do these 18 completely independent things. If there's any note-on information, I'm going to transpose them. For each one of these 18 steps, I'm going to transmit some MIDI CC 102 information to whoever cares Any receiving module downstream is now going to receive new MIDI information that wasn't on the incoming channel. So the FlexPhraser is basically baking all of this into the MIDI package and then passing it on to the next module, which happens to be the analog synth layer. It can do whatever it wants with that information, but the FlexPhraser's done its job at that point. It doesn't really care whether or not you subscribe to this information. And the user area has pre-built phrasers in the same way that the parent phrasor does. If we open the select phrase drop down, let's have a look in step sequence and we'll choose a glissando. So as you can see, this is a 32-step sequence that's going to start 2 octaves above the played note and end up 2.5 octaves below. I'm going to jump back over to the velocity curve to demonstrate this next section. And I'm going to engage key assign mode, this little keyboard symbol, seemingly unassuming symbol. Let's press that. And suddenly all of our transpose values disappear. They are still there. The glissando phrase is still in the background, but we now have an opportunity to interact with that glissando phrase. In order to do so, we need to set key replace to anything other than off. This is a really strange place to put like a master control for what we're about to do. But basically, if key replace is off, nothing that I'm about to do would work. I'm going to switch it to one of the other values. I'm going to set key replace to rest. That's a nice default position. Let's just check we've still got our glissando. Indeed we do. The next thing I need to do is put mode in anything other than step or chord. This is, like I say, mind-boggling is the right phrase for this. Let's set it to up. And suddenly key selection is engaged. It's now active, ready for instructions. By default, the phrase will be played back as normal. P stands for phrase. But I can override that default behavior. I'm going to click on one of these P's and start dragging up with my mouse. I'm going to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, A. There's another one as well in there somewhere, L. So it goes P, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, L, A. P stands for phrase. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 specifies an exact note that's going to be played, an exact offset according to this kind of user bank of data. So if I'm playing a C major chord, now C is note number 1, E is note number 2, G is note number 3, and those offsets will be applied over the top of the glissando as effectively a mask. Just start messing with some of these numbers. I'm going to set them between 1, 2, and 3 because I'm only going to play a 3-note chord. And I'll bring my number of steps down a little bit so it's not quite so onerous. Let's have a 10-step sequence. Slow it down so we can have some hope of trying to follow what's actually happening here. So it's trying to play the glissando phrase. Every time it comes across a P, it will play the next note in its kind of glissando section, glissando instruction bank. But I'm playing these 3 offset notes, C, E, and G, and they're overriding this default behavior of the glissando. Remember when I said try not to worry too much about the specifics of the FlexPhraser? You'll very quickly get absolutely lost in a sea of offsets and confusion. Just use it as a means of getting cool stuff up and running. Make it a little bit more straightforward with an 8-step sequence. L means it will play the last played note, which in my case is a G. And A means play a chord. So now it's going to play all 3 notes. All of those notes are still being applied as offsets to whatever the glissando is trying to do in the background. As you might be kind of just about glimpsing, the capacity to create really complicated phrases is effectively endless. It's only bounded by your imagination. If I'm ever in this kind of area in the FlexPhraser, I try not to overthink it. Just mess around with controls until you get something really cool. Turning steps on and off is a really nice way to generate interesting patterns as well. If I play a single note, you have some chance of kind of catching the glissando that's still trying to play in the background. Those offset notes are still there. One very quick point I meant to make earlier but forgot. You remember I've got this guitar line loaded up. This is what we dragged out of the one finger fast preset. I'm just going to load that back in very quickly to demonstrate that if you have a FlexPhraser engaged and you play the notes out of that FlexPhraser, it's not going to sound the way you want it to, because the FlexPhraser, if it's active all the time. It's not expecting you to play lots of complex notes like there are in this sequence. Turn your FlexPhraser off. If you want to play the MIDI information back, if I press play now, that's the MIDI part playing back exactly as written. So this is the information that's come out of the FlexPhraser. If I left the FlexPhraser engaged, it's going to interpret every single one of those notes as an instruction to refire the FlexPhraser again, and that's absolutely not what you want. This won't sound good. See, all of those triggers are constantly kind of stumbling across each other. So just remember, if you ever drag MIDI into Cubase, turn the FlexPhraser off, or you'll spend about 30 seconds wondering what on earth you're hearing before you realise what you've done. That'll do us for today. Hope you enjoyed the episode. Please hit like if you did. I'll see you next time. Thanks very much.